Canada's Bank Governor Tiff Macklem confirmed that if the government reduced its deficit, we'd have lower inflation. Inflation now costs every Canadian $3,500 more every year. Yep. Again, his words, not ours. Now that we know that the Prime Minister's continued extravagant spending spree is the cause of it, will they give Canadians a fighting chance and stop their spending so that they can pay their bills?
Here, here, here.
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Associate Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, once upon a time, all members of this House respected Canada's institutions. Conservatives of that era must really be lamenting the state of their party today. A party that tells false narratives about our economy, that attacks our institutions, and that systematically refuses to support Canadians in their time of need when they need it the most. They don't have a plan. We do. Thankfully for Canadians, we're on the job.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't story time. It's question period.
Right.
The plan that he is talking about has driven 1.5 million Canadians into a food bank in a month. That's nothing to be proud of.
Absolutely.
To make matters worse, he believes that $3,500 a year more is not enough. They're reaching even deeper into the pockets of Canadians to pay for their plan to triple the carbon tax on gas, groceries, and home heating. They know the plan hasn't worked. Why push a costly, failed carbon tax on struggling Canadians?
Here, here.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the story that the Conservatives don't want Canadians to be told is the fact that since 2015, not one, not three, not four, not five, but 6 times at a minimum, Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government has voted against tax reductions for Canadians. In 2015, when we reduced taxes on the middle class, they voted against. When we reduced taxes on workers, how did they vote, Mr. Speaker? They voted against. Mr. Speaker, when we got the child care program in place, how did they vote against? They voted against, Mr. Speaker. And just last week, when we reduced taxes on the small business, how did they vote? Against.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, the government is raising taxes on Canadians. It's tripling the carbon tax. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says that 60% of Canadians will pay more than they ever get back. That's a tax. It'll cost an Albertan more than $2,000 after the rebate. In Ontario, almost $1,500 after the rebate. It's on page 13 of the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report, and the Minister should read it. So I want to know, are they calling the Parliamentary Budget Officer a liar, or is today the day they'll finally be honest with Canadians about their tax plan?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's share the facts about where we are when we're fighting climate change. Mr. Speaker, Albertans lived through the heat dome. We saw the atmospheric river in BC. We just lived through the worst natural climate disaster in the history of our country with Hurricane Fiona. Mr. Speaker, our economists, people all the way back to the founder of the Reform Party, Preston Manning, said the best market mechanism to make sure that we fight climate change is to price pollution. We have done just that. Albertans get $1,100 more than they spend. That's the facts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, inflation is having devastating effects on Canadian families, and the biggest problem is with food, which is essential. 1.5 million Canadians last month resorted to community fridges and food banks right here at home in Canada. That's the impact of inflation. But the government is a glutton when it comes to taxing people because they want to triple the carbon tax next year. Is there any minister in that government that will stand up and say, yes, raising taxes in inflationary times is a good idea? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear with the facts. For 7 years, the Liberal government has systematically been reducing taxes on Canadians, and every time the opposition, the Conservatives, have voted against it. When we reduced taxes for the middle class, they voted against. When we reduced taxes for workers, they voted against. When we provided for cheaper childcare, they voted against. But, Mr. Speaker, on this side, we vote for Canadians. The Conservatives vote against. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Here's the facts. After 7 years of Liberal rule with the carbon tax, The fact is that we are ranked 58th out of 63 when it comes to fighting climate change. It's not working, the carbon tax. The government wants to triple the carbon tax next year. And can the minister, with a straight face, stand up and say, yes, it's good news. We're raising taxes in times of inflation? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear, let's be specific. There will be no tripling of the carbon tax next year. That's totally false. We also know that a price on pollution doesn't apply in Quebec, not federally anyways. They have their own system. Mr. Speaker, the worst storm, Hurricane Fiona, in Canadian history was a recent disaster, and the best solution is putting a price on pollution, and that's what we did.
Mr. Speaker, the Governor of the Bank of Canada confirmed this week what Conservatives have been saying, that inflation is higher because of the Liberals' wasteful spending. He also said that the average Canadian is paying $3,500 more a year because of inflation. Wow. That's not per family, that's per person. No wonder people can't afford to heat their homes. Will the Liberals stop forcing their failed carbon tax on hardworking Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Associate Minister of Finance.
We're facing a tough time, as are people around the world, due to rising global inflation. And this weekend, Mr. Speaker, residents in my own riding of Edmonton Centre thanked us for reducing childcare because they said it's really making a difference. But, Mr. Speaker, we're doing more than that for the residents of Kelowna Lake Country and people across the country by eliminating interest in student apprentice loan interest, by speeding up the Canada Worker benefit, by providing a $500 housing top-up, by providing dental care to 500,000 kids, by making housing more affordable. And, Mr. Speaker, it may not matter to some Conservatives that we're putting $500 in people's pockets, but we're doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals would have everyone believe that Canadians have never had it so great. You know, I was speaking with a senior from my community recently who was forced to make the tough decision to sell his home because he couldn't afford to live in it anymore. I attended a fundraiser in Joe Rich in my community where neighbours were coming together to raise money so that neighbours could afford basic necessities. This is Canada. This is what's happening. Stop the pain. Will the Liberals stop forcing their failed carbon tax on hardworking Canadians that can barely afford basic necessities?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Seniors.
Mr. Speaker, day in and day out, Conservatives stand up and profess to support seniors. Year after year, since we've come into government in 2015, they voted against everything that we've done for seniors. Mr. Speaker, that dog won't bark. Canadian seniors know who has their back, and it's not the Conservative Party of Canada.
Good. The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP Liberal Costly Coalition's carbon tax makes everything more expensive. Half of Canadians are already $200 away from bankruptcy each month. They now have to pay more in taxes than they can afford in food, clothing, and shelter combined. The prices for gas, groceries, and home heating are at record highs, and a record number of students, seniors, families, and working Canadians have to go to food banks. Wow. So when will the Liberals stop forcing their failed carbon tax on struggling Canadians?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good news, Mr. Speaker. Good news particularly for Atlantic Canadians. On July 1st, Mr. Speaker, the pricing of pollution and the climate action rebate will be coming to 3 Atlantic provinces. A family of 4 will receive up to $248. Your home province, Mr. Speaker, $248 in Nova Scotia, $240 in PEI, $328 in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that comes quarterly, Mr. Speaker. 8 out of 10 families will benefit, Mr. Speaker. The Conservatives should stop the climate denial and get on board with climate change.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
But, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that carbon tax is up and so are emissions. On top of that, the Liberals' claims about rebates are misleading because they're only talking about the carbon tax line item on people's bills. But their own budget watchdog confirms what Conservatives have always warned. Carbon taxes drive up the cost of everything, so most Canadians pay more than they get back. That's why the PBO says, quote, most households incur a net loss because of the carbon tax. So the tax is up, emissions are up, prices are up, and the Liberals will make it 3 times worse. Why won't they axe their failed carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
As usual, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are peddling misinformation. Emissions are going down. We're on track to make our targets by 2030, Mr. Speaker. But let's listen again to the Conservative record. They cut $350 million from the Environment and Climate Change budget. They withdrew from the Kyoto Climate Accord, which blew up our emissions targets, Mr. Speaker. They did nothing for 10 long years, Mr. Speaker, and now they're blaming us for their inaction.
The Honourable Member for Coast Bay, Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives don't lash out at hard-working Canadians when they want their concerns to be heard. But that's exactly what the Senior Minister from Newfoundland and Labrador did this week when he said he's sick and tired of people talking about the cold weather. Atlantic Canadians are sick and tired of being told to sit down, stop complaining, and look the other way while this government reaches into their wallets and takes our hard-earned cash to pay for policies that just don't work. Mr. Speaker, when will the Minister from St. John's South Mount Pearl apologize for his shameful comments and implore his party to axe the tax?
Yeah!
The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what's shameful. I'll tell you what's shameful, Mr. Speaker. It's when Conservatives vote.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Finance. The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about the Conservative record on reducing taxes for Canadians. Doesn't exist. So there's not a lot to say. But I can tell you about the Liberal record on cutting tax, Mr. Speaker, which is the Canada Child Benefit, they voted against. Cutting taxes on the middle class, they voted against. $15 minimum wage, they voted against. Providing dental and rental supports for 500,000 kids. How did they vote, Mr. Speaker? Against.
The Honourable Member for Coast Bay, Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, we've had multiple votes where we've asked this government to vote with us to get rid of carbon tax and reduce HST. Just this week, the voice of the common man, VOCM, the Newfoundland and Labrador, released a poll. 91% of respondents said a federal carbon tax is not necessary in light of high fuel prices. The people of Newfoundland and Labrador and the Maritimes have seen the failure of carbon tax in the rest of Canada. They've heard the PBO tell them that 60% of Canadians pay more than they receive in carbon tax. So will the Prime Minister, if he won't listen to Conservatives, won't listen to the PBO, will he listen to the voice of the common man and axe the carbon tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And more good news for Atlantic Canadians. In 3 provinces, they're going to have access to the Climate Action Rebate, and that's going to put more money in their pockets, Mr. Speaker. But even more good news, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of millions of dollars will be flowing into those 4 Atlantic provinces to help them move away from polluting, expensive heating oil, Mr. Speaker, to greener forms of energy, Mr. Speaker. We're focused like a laser beam on affordability, on fighting climate change. The Conservatives are focused on neither. Hear, hear.